You're listening to the Diplomats podcast on Asian geopolitics. As always, I'm your host from New York City, Ankit Panda.
And this is Prashant Parmeswaran from Washington, D.C. How are you doing today, Ankit?
Doing well, Prashant. Good to be back with you after a lot of travel, I guess, for the both of us. How was Thailand?
Yeah, it was good. I got an opportunity to do a couple of interactions with the Foreign Ministry and Defense Ministry, and they're certainly thinking a lot about foreign policy with Thailand's ASEAN chairmanship coming up next year, as well as elections. So a lot of busy work for the bureaucrats there. How
hmm
was your trip to Russia?
It was good. It was good. It was my first time in Russia. Certainly an exciting time to visit since when I was there, the dramatics in the Kerch Strait were going down over in the
Mm,
Black Sea. So that was an interesting time to be there. I was there for a track to interaction with Russian and Chinese experts on the Korean Peninsula, sharing perspectives on issues there. It was a little strange because there were no Koreans participating, which I think is a little strange, a little bit of a great power hoedown. But it was useful. It was good to kind of see the places where gaps remain between Russia, China, and the United States on issues on the Korean Peninsula. And I think those gaps are pretty apparent, especially when it comes to discussions of how to move forward with pretty much everybody: South Korea, North Korea, Russia, China, everybody except Japan of the old six parties supporting a less than all or nothing approach. But the Trump administration and I think Tokyo both are still quite comfortable taking an all or nothing approach to North Korea, which I think is probably going to yield the latter instead of the former. So yeah, we'll see where things go.
Yeah, I think that kind of perspective is really useful because, as we'll sort of focus today on Indian Ocean issues, but I do think that this is a theme that has pervaded a lot of our conversations, which is that at times when you look at great power, major power competition, there's often a tendency to look at it from the perspective of, whether it's China, India, or China, Russia, or US, China. But there really is, a value in visiting these individual countries and figuring out where perceptions align and diverge from that, right?
Yeah, absolutely. There's no
Yeah.
uh, there's no substitute for the real thing when it comes to interacting with folks from other places. I mean, that's just really kind of the baseline for what we try to do.
hmm Absolutely. So today, I think what we could do is we're in a process of significant developments in the Indian Ocean region, as we've talked about previously on the podcast, particularly with India's neighborhood relationships over the past few months. We've had significant developments in the Maldives, in particular, with the new administration there, as well as and a country that doesn't get as much focus and attention on the podcast, Bhutan. And both of those countries are going to be in the spotlight more so than usual next month, with two key trips that are slated to take place in New Delhi, and that will sort of serve as a launch for our conversation on the Indian Ocean, in terms of the fact that this really will put the focus on two countries which have been part of this alignment between India and its relationships in the Indian Ocean, but also this ongoing conversation we have about India and China and their rising competition in the Indian Ocean as well, alongside other players. So you wrote a piece for us just recently, earlier this week, about how these two trips and really shine the spotlight on India's neighborhood relationships. So maybe what we can do as a starting point is talk about what these two important relationships say about India's relationships with the Indian Ocean region, as well as its relative position with respect to China and other powers.
Yeah, so I think the first thing to say is I think you're right to bring up China as a framing tool. Certainly, with both the Maldives and Bhutan, there have been different but present concerns about China's role. The relationships that both of these countries have with China is obviously very different. Bhutan and China do not have official diplomatic ties. They have an outstanding territorial dispute. The way
hmm
Bhutan conducts diplomacy with China is through the ambassadors for both countries that sit in New Delhi, Whereas the Maldives has official diplomatic ties with China. Not only that, but under the previous leader, the authoritarian-leaning president Abdullah Yamin. And for listeners who are more interested in kind of the nuts and bolts of the Maldives, we've done a few podcasts on this recently. So definitely go check that out if you're interested a bit in Abdullah Yamin and what his tenure really meant for that country. So not only did official ties exist there, but Yamin was sort of one of those classic, leaders in the region who undertook too much Chinese debt and really pivoted the Maldives away from its historical India-first foreign policy towards China. So for New Delhi, both these upcoming visits later this month, I believe there hasn't been a date yet announced for the Bhutanese Prime Minister Lotte Shering's visit, but the new Maldivian president Ibu Soli is scheduled to arrive in New Delhi on December 17th. But both of these visits, I think, are eagerly being anticipated in India, and for a variety of reasons. I think the Maldives one is getting the most focus because this has really been a topsy-turvy year for India in the Maldives. So earlier this year, there was a serious debate in India about potential military intervention in the Maldives after Yamin declared a state of emergency. Under his tenure, democracy and the rule of law and human rights had been gradually receding. So there are a number of cases that we can point to. It really kind of all took off with the sham trial of the former democratically elected president, Mohammad Nasheed, who eventually managed to leave the country for health reasons, went into exile, and became a vocal critic of the regime from the outside. But Yamin really cracked down on the opposition, cracked down on everything, to the point where the September elections, which we discussed on a previous episode, were really, nobody thought those elections would be free or fair. Everybody expected Yamin to sort of twist the institutions of the state to ensure that he managed to win, but there's one thing that you can't really tamper with, which is the kind of historic turnout that the Maldives saw. It was, nearly 90% of Maldives citizens that were eligible to vote cast ballots. And Yamin simply wasn't able to turn the tide. He tried to contest the result at the Supreme Court, but that didn't go anywhere. And lo and behold, Soli was inaugurated. So a big difference between Bhutan and the Maldives, too, insofar as India's neighborhood policy is concerned, is that Bhutan was Modi's first overseas trip after he became prime minister. He went there very shortly after his inauguration to really hit home the fact that Bhutan is in many ways India's closest neighborhood partner, just given the depth of the security relationship between the two countries. Bhutan is the smallest country in India's neighborhood, but certainly it is the closest relationship. India effectively guarantees Bhutan's security. With the Maldives, however, it's the complete opposite. Modi had never been there under Yamin's tenure, and he went there for the first time to witness Soli's inauguration. And Soli's inaugural speech did acknowledge that he would be pivoting the country back to an India-first approach. So obviously for New Delhi, this was a welcome decision and really a sign that, when that intervention debate was going on, the idea of India simply waiting and seeing was kind of what the government was doing, but I think a lot of commentators didn't necessarily see the value in that, right? I mean, it was either India had to act now or risk losing the Maldives, which sits just off the southern tip of the Indian Peninsula to China. But the wait-and-see approach effectively worked. Democracy worked in the Maldives, and now there's a pro-India leader who's going to be coming to New Delhi soon.
Right. Absolutely. I mean, I think that's a really good way to capture some of the similarities, but also some of the distinctions between the two cases. I think one of the interesting points of conversation for both of these visits has been, what are some of among the key agenda items that will be discussed during the visits, right? So you mentioned in your piece, for example, with respect to Bhutan, that one of the agenda items would be a new power project that India is expected to commission there. And I think, one of the things that we've been discussing in a number of these podcasts now is that when you do have these periods of, new elections, new governments coming to power, and there is a window of opportunity for certain powers over others, in this case, India, with respect to the Maldives, but also in Bhutan, increasingly, in the face of this new competition with China, it also does put pressure upon these powers to demonstrate the fact that they can actually, either fill a void or actually serve as an opportunity for these countries to meet their needs. So, in the case of Bhutan, one of the things that has been referenced has been the Bhutan's new foreign minister in an interview in the Hindu, sort of talked about how naturally, given the fact that there was that interview and the upcoming visit, that he was prioritizing India and that Bhutan would continue to adopt an India first approach. But one of the striking things, reading through that interview as well, is that from the Bhutanese side, there was a focus on a lot of their domestic economic priorities, right? Whether it's domestic revenues or managing the debt, whereas some of the questions were targeted more at India and its role and how Bhutan would approach India. So I do think in both these cases we are dealing with sort of a natural thing that we see with respect to smaller countries and bigger powers, which is sometimes these smaller countries are trying to leverage various powers for their own security and economic needs, but these bigger powers tend to be concerned about what these smaller countries are doing with respect to their individual interests as well, right? So I think one of the things that would be interesting to hear is how are these two things being calibrated? The individual interests of these smaller states, but also the interests of the major powers, including India.
Yeah, so I think you've hit on a really important point, and maybe we'll talk about it in the context of other neighborhood states, which is that the way that geopolitics discussions kind of frame a lot of what's happening in India's neighborhood is in terms of India versus China,
Hmm.
and in terms of when elections happen, certain leaders are pro-India, certain leaders are anti-India. That's kind of the framing that goes around. But really, I mean, it's always a more nuanced reality that many of these politicians and leaders are operating in their perceived national interest, but also in some cases, their own personal interests. In some cases, maybe we can talk a bit
Hmm.
about that in Sri Lanka with Rajapaksa's return, which we've discussed recently too. But effectively, what this has meant, and I think the way that we've seen this sort of feed back into Indian foreign policy in the neighborhood, is that I think New Delhi's figured out that it's counterproductive to really push these countries to pick between India and China. That as a consequence of China getting as large and as ambitious in its foreign policy as it has become under Xi Jinping and its pursuit of the Belt and Road Initiative and projects in South Asia and elsewhere, it's really a failing strategy for India to try to compete dollar for dollar with China, which is a race that India will always lose. So if that's the basis on which India wants to demonstrate value to neighborhood states, it's always going to come short. So the other factor is to really, work up the benefits of local geography. So India can provide connectivity in a way that China simply can't, especially with countries like Bhutan and the Maldives, given the proximity. In Bhutan's case, given the border, a big reason hydroelectric dam projects have been popular in Bhutan is effectively the country's one of the country's major export strategies is to turn itself into a virtual battery for the Indian Northeast and for West Bengal by sort of offering to output a massive amount of energy, generate more than it'll actually use domestically. So that's a big factor there. But also, I mean, the geopolitics aren't entirely left on the sidelines, especially in Bhutan's case. The last time we talked about Bhutan on this podcast, I'm fairly sure, was in the context of last year's standoff at Doklam.
Hmm.
So for listeners that aren't familiar with what that was, last year, Indian soldiers, Indian Army troops, and Chinese People's Liberation Army troops found themselves at a standoff on the Doklam Plateau, which is a piece of territory administered by Bhutan that is claimed by China, and India supports the Bhutanese claim in that area. And India considers that area to be of strategic relevance, especially as access to that plateau grants China an ability to further penetrate south towards India's vulnerable, or at least perceived to be vulnerable, Siliguri corridor, sometimes known as the chicken neck. That's if you look at a map of India, that's that really tiny part of the country that connects the massive western part of the country to the comparatively less developed and more vulnerable northeast area. So that standoff really highlighted Bhutan's circumstances as kind of being sandwiched between these two great powers. So I think that dynamic is there, Prashant. And, one of the reasons this upcoming prime ministerial visit from Bhutan matters, in my view, is because the Bhutanese elections, just happened. And they didn't actually get a lot of attention. But in the lead up, one of the interesting factors that was part of the national debate in Bhutan, which is a new democracy, it's a constitutional democracy, but still quite new to the exercise of sort of campaigning and elections and all that. One of the big factors this year was sort of Bhutanese sovereignty. And it wasn't necessarily couched in anti-India terms, but definitely I think there's a sense now in Bhutan that, with geopolitics and with Bhutan's size, there does come a certain sense of vulnerability. So I think it's unsurprising that we're seeing the Bhutanese foreign minister in his interview discuss things like all of this, the domestic agenda and how India can really help enable that. So I think that's where things really stand right now with Bhutan.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a really important point to emphasize. The fact that, during the elections, we did see that focus on, sovereignty, diversification, and how that, sometimes we've seen in a number of these elections, leaders, particularly those who are, running for office at a particular time, will emphasize the fact that they're trying to, strike a new deal or a more independent position. But what they actually do in office may end up being quite different from what they're actually saying on the campaign. So I do think in some of these instances, it really is interesting to map out what these countries and leaders are saying versus what they actually do when they're in office. And so that will be, I think, at play in both these cases. I think the other point that you make that's really important to emphasize is that if we're thinking about this in terms of countries and how they're trying to balance their relationships with different powers, it really is important to pay attention to what the strengths and weaknesses of each of these individual powers are. And you pointed out with India, one of their biggest strengths is geography and proximity. It's been really interesting to see. I mean, one of the other things that we're seeing India do, for example, is with respect to the Maldives, trying to include it in some of the diplomatic organizations, like the Indian Ocean Rim Association, for example, that the Maldives was admitted into. I think that this is a really interesting case where Indian diplomacy and security and diplomatic architecture in the region is becoming itself a opportunity for India to demonstrate that there are various areas beyond economics or conventional security where it can play a role.
That's right. Yeah, and there are, other institutions that have come more into play recently, like BIMSTEC, that the economic corridor has sort of been reactivated after a long period of relative inactivity. SARC, in the meantime, has been sort of de-emphasized, given the inherent contradictions that come with any organization that has India and Pakistan as members. So, those neighborhood dynamics, I think, have been really interesting too.
Yep, absolutely. I mean, maybe we can talk briefly about Sri Lanka. I mean, we've talked about this briefly in the podcast before, but how did the dynamics that we're talking about here play into Sri Lanka and the very much evolving political situation there?
Well, yeah. So the funny thing with Sri Lanka is that it's this sort of coincidental nature of the neighborhood during Modi's tenure, which is that every time one country is perceived to perceived to have taken a step forward in favor of India's interests, somewhere else inevitably there's a backward step, right? We've seen this happen in Nepal, and we've seen this now happen in Sri Lanka. So in January 2015, when Maithripala Sirisena unexpectedly defeated Mahinda Rajapaksa in the election, India was obviously pleased. It was very similar to kind of the Maldives outcome. Everybody had expected Rajapaksa, who was an authoritarian leaning leader, to effectively win that election either by using untoward means or election rigging, but it ended up that Sirisena, who had released a foreign policy manifesto emphasizing that he would like to rebalance Sri Lanka's ties towards India and China sort of evenly, ended up winning. But now we're in the throes of a constitutional crisis that's still ongoing, and the risk for violence is high, as we've discussed on a recent episode here at the podcast. So I think the Indian approach to Sri Lanka right now is, again, a bit of wait and see. There's a degree of caution here because, Rajapaksa might end up sticking this through, even if right now that appears to be a little bit more in doubt than it was a week ago. Things are moving pretty quickly there still. So I think, maybe that's a lesson that India takes away from kind of the Maldives episode. But also, not to segue, but that's also a lesson that India takes away from Nepal. The government in Nepal right now is back in the hands of the Marxist communists being led by KP Oli, who is famously not the most friendly towards India, even though he does do business and recognizes that India is Nepal's biggest economic partner. But at one time, it seemed like things in Nepal might have gone another way after the constitutional crisis there, after the promulgation of the September 2015 constitution, when India sort of, I think, generally is seen to have made a mistake in sponsoring an unofficial blockade and effectively criticizing regularly the Nepali government in a way that was seen as heavy-handed interference in domestic affairs in Nepal. So I think the lesson now for Sri Lanka from all this is that perhaps the best approach is to wait and see and to continue to try to keep up the institutionalized processes of foreign policy and diplomacy that exist there,
Right.
but avoiding to really kind of mucking things up by seeing by being seen as kind of an overbearing foreign hand trying to maneuver.
Right, absolutely. And I think in the recent string of elections in the Indian Ocean and India's neighborhood, so we saw recently the elections in Pakistan and Imran Khan coming to power, and I guess the next one will be Bangladesh with the December 30th general election, which has been talked about quite a bit. And that's probably the next, I guess, domestic political development that we're watching in the Indian Ocean, among others. And there, I guess, there's this theme about domestic politics, but also Bangladesh's role in the region. It's going to be, I think, chairing IORA in 2023, I think. It's
Oh,
vice chair
okay.
out 2019, 2021. So there is that sort of evolving cycle, as you mentioned, about general elections and the evolution of domestic politics there. Um, but I guess one of the interesting things to sort of reference here, and you pointed out this before at the outset, which is beyond China and India, which we've been talking about here, there are other actors in the Indian Ocean that are playing a more active role, as we're seeing, for example, the U.S. Indo-Pacific vision, European states being more involved in the Indian Ocean as well. So the UK announcing that it opened an embassy in the Maldives quite recently. So I think, one of the things that'll be interesting to reflect on is, I mean, what role do we see for other outside powers playing in the Indian Ocean as this sort of Sino-Indian rivalry heats up in the Indian Ocean, as well as, other actors trying to broaden out their strategies beyond just the Asia Pacific or specific subregions?
Yeah, I mean, the Indian Ocean is definitely, I guess you could call it a hot geopolitical region, right? I mean, the
Hmm.
Indo-Pacific strategies. Two big actors that I think are really going to step up their involvement in the Indian Ocean are Australia and Japan, both
Hmm.
sort of as part of the Quad grouping. It's not an alliance. It's not really even an entente or a coalition. It's just a group of four countries that share some values, and three of them happen to be allies, and they are all democracies, and they talk about things, and they occasionally conduct military exercises, and they're sort of networking trilaterals within that quadrilateral grouping, all of them kind of deepening their defense cooperation with a focus on the Indian Ocean. Japan has been increasing its deployments there. China, as we know, for now about 3 years, has been regularly deploying to the Indian Ocean. It has set up a base in Djibouti. It's conducting anti-piracy operation. It has a probable dual-use port facility under development at Gwadar, the southern terminus of the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. Foreign powers in the Indian Ocean sort of go hand in hand. France, I think, is an interesting actor there, as we've
Right.
talked about on previous episodes. They have a range of territories across the Indo-Pacific, and they really see themselves as a major Indo-Pacific power. They actually have a massive amount of exclusive economic zone in the Indo-Pacific region, so they certainly see a role for themselves there, as do the Brits. There are a range of external powers that are playing a role there in the Indian Ocean. With Bangladesh, it reminded me when you brought up the issue of Bangladesh. I mean, Bangladesh, I think, has been seen as one of the stable, bright spots for the Modi government's neighborhood policy. I mean, certainly in 2014, shortly after Modi comes in, India and Bangladesh sort of set the gold standard for how to handle an international arbitration decision
Hmm.
over their kind of maritime boundary dispute. They agreed to what the tribunal decided in The Hague, and they implemented this, which is something that Indian analysts, were able to point to after China refused to do the same in the aftermath of the July 2016 South China Sea verdict. So there was that during Modi's, I believe it was June 2015, when India and Bangladesh resolved their land border dispute, which had been nagging them for a couple decades or more than that. And more recently, I think, a lot of the issues in Bangladesh have been on the domestic side, notwithstanding the challenge from hosting hundreds of thousands of Rohingya refugees in the country's south. But the Hasina government's broader authoritarian turn and crackdown on the opposition. So I think this upcoming election later this month is going to be something to watch quite closely, particularly if it doesn't go the way of the opposition, if there'll be wider protests and potentially even violence. So there's a new opposition coalition now that the Bangladesh National Party, which had recently was thought to be sitting out the elections, has now joined. So it'll be interesting to see how they end up performing. On the Pakistan side of the ledger, I think things are interesting right now with the hubbub around the Kartarpur corridor, which is really kind of the only real significant development that's happened in India-Pakistan bilateral ties since the September 2016 Uri attacks, which effectively led to a deep freeze between the two in 2017, especially as Nawaz Sharif was dealing with his domestic issues and there was an upcoming election. And by the time that election was over and Imran Khan was inaugurated, Indian election season has effectively, been in full swing. So the BJP is looking forward to the elections there next year in probably late April and May. So yeah, I don't think there's going to be any major developments on the India-Pakistan front, apart from this, the Kartarpur corridor issue that's opened up and is being seen as something of a confidence-building stepping stone to potential talks after the next elections. But right now, I think things are kind of on a pretty steady trajectory there.
Yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned the Rohingya issue because it's a constant reminder to us that as we cover these various subregions in Asia, there really is a lot of crossover, right, between these various subregions. So when there was a discussion about Myanmar's admission to IORA, for example, one of the points of opposition that was registered was the fact that there is this, lingering Rohingya issue, and that's affected Bangladesh and really shone the spotlight on some of the human rights issues that remain in the country. So, I mean, these geopolitical issues and domestic political issues really cross over subregions when we really step back and think about it.
Yeah, and I think India's approach towards the Rohingya issue has been notable. I mean, India really hasn't staked out a norms-based position at all. It's been quite realistic, you could say. I mean, kind of the similar approach that the meeting recently between Modi and Mohammed bin Salman received. When Modi received Aung San Suu Kyi in India, while the world was kind of condemning her over her handling of the Rohingya situation, India really said or did nothing. I mean, it's really been remarkable to kind of see that realism come into play. I mean, India really does see Myanmar as a huge opportunity, especially after the NLD took over, and Myanmar is kind of seen as India's gateway to continental Southeast Asia and to the broader region. So especially as far as the Act East policy goes, it kind of begins and ends with Myanmar.
So before we close, Ankit, I mean, since we're kind of ending 2018 here, looking to 2019, is there anything you're looking at with respect to the Indian Ocean and India's neighborhood policy that you think listeners should kind of pay attention to or focus on moving forward?
Well, so I think on all these countries, I think have a very interesting year ahead of them. Beginning with Bhutan, one of the things I've been tracking closely, I spent a lot of time covering the Doklam issue last year and the Bhutan-China border talks. So there'll probably be another round of border talks between the new government and the Chinese side. And it'll be interesting to see if that goes anywhere. I believe this will be the 30th round or something like that, or maybe in the high 20s. I'm not exactly sure, but they've had a lot of these talks over 2 decades now, and there's been no comprehensive resolution. And the Bhutanese say they would like to get there, and so do the Chinese. But the concern on the Indian side has been that the Bhutanese will give away something that the Indians don't want them to, and Bhutan understands that. So it'll be interesting to see how the new government maneuvers there. On Pakistan, like I said, I mean, the issue to look for there is, how Imran Khan's relationship with the Pakistani military develops, since that's always been a major determinant of how Pakistan approaches India, but also the outcome of the Indian elections. And I'm not going to prognosticate about what's going to happen there. That's a whole separate podcast for another day. But I think the outcome of those elections will, naturally be a huge event in the region's geopolitics. Bangladesh, like we said, we have these elections ending out the year, so I think we're going to kick off the year with potentially a new round of political instability, regardless of the outcome. If the Awami League kind of closes it out in a blowout, you can expect the opposition to be upset with that, and at the same, by the same token, if the opposition ends up performing better than expected, I think we can expect instability. Maldives, I think it's a bright new year. We can look forward to watching Ibu Soli implement his bright vision. I mean, I think the country has problems ahead of it, given the amounts of Chinese debt and other issues, but certainly a lot to look forward to there. Same thing with Sri Lanka. On the other side of the ledger, though, looking for this constitutional crisis to be resolved, With Nepal, I think really looking forward to watching its calibration of its kind of balancing act between India and China. I think we'll see a lot more happen, especially on the Chinese side of the ledger. I think Nepal recognizes its reliance on India, but it's certainly one of those countries in the region that is actively hedging by increasing its relationship with China.
Hmm.
So yeah, I think that's kind of the lay of the land in the neighborhood. Certainly an exciting region, and I'm sure we'll come back to it soon on the podcast.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think with that, we'll kind of leave it there for now. Sound good?
That sounds good to me.
Yep. So, listeners, thanks for listening. And if you want to leave us a review on iTunes if you like what you're hearing, please do so. That always helps. And thanks for listening.
We'll be back next week with more. Thanks.